We don't cancel each other out. That's what it sounds like. Is Michael Grady going to do a walkthrough?
He's coming in,
Sir.
yeah. He may walk in while you're still going, but yes, I think we have it scheduled for him to come right in afterwards and walk through the.
My prepared comments are very brief, but I'm happy to take questions or talk further. So thank you for having me here today. Introduction to H706, Pollinator Protection Bill. And I want to start out by really commending this committee for the work that you've already done, laying groundwork on this issue with testimony from the Ag Innovation Board and Beekeepers Association and UVM and the Bee Lab, and really doing a lot of extensive work for an informed debate about this and other pollinator-related issues. The work that you've done almost makes this introduction unnecessary, but only almost, so you're not entirely off the hook. It's just briefer. Neonicotinoid use has been increasing since the 1990s to the point where virtually 100% of corn in Vermont and 30% of soybeans are grown using treated seed. Along with that growing use is a growing body of research examining in detail not just the damage that neonics wreak on pollinators of many species and the environment at large, but also examining the claimed benefits from their use and what viable alternatives may be, whether untreated or alternative treatments. In addition to the great research being carried out here in Vermont and at the Cornell Lab in New York, we have the benefit of 5 years of experience in Quebec, where neonics have been prohibited since 2019. And so this is no longer a theoretical discussion. We have data of what happens or doesn't happen when these chemicals are not used. Until now, the possible actions that Vermont could take to reduce the use of neonics has been limited and largely symbolic. But New York's adoption of the Birds and Bees Act provides a potent economic tool for change, a powerful incentive for pesticide and seed producers to develop alternative projects and distribution systems for untreated seed, and a powerful incentive to reinvigorate IPM practices and non-chemical or alternative farming practices. By partnering with New York's effort, we can help them to achieve their goals while reaping our own benefits from their efforts. The bill as written has 3 major components. First, it prohibits the sale or use of corn, soy, wheat, and cereal seeds treated with neonicotinoids. It also ultimately prohibits many foliar applications to crops, plants, and turf that risk significant harm to pollinators. And these kick in at certain times. Critically, it allows the Agency of Natural Resources, in consultation with the Agency of Agriculture, Food and Markets, to provide emergency exemptions if the market fails to provide an adequate supply of untreated seed, or if enforcement would create financial hardship for farmers. So there are exemptions to this as needed. Thirdly, it provides time for the market to innovation and adaptation. Since this bill was drafted, New York State has extended the timelines of their law, and I fully expect that we will update our timelines to match those, which would further extend the timelines from the way it was written. And finally, I just want to clarify that this bill does not pit dairy farmers against beekeepers or environmentalists against polluters, because we're all stewards of the land, and we all take that seriously. I mean, farmers, whether they raise bees or cows, are are serious about their stewardship responsibilities, obligations, and proud of their what they do. And I want to recognize, the steps that have been taken in reducing use of some of the more toxic pesticides over time, increasing things that promote land health like cover cropping, no-till farming, and these are all things that I believe that we are doing together. And so I really see this as a cooperative bill, not pitting one group of farmers that raises small six-legged creatures against another group that raises large four-legged creatures. So the ultimate purpose of this bill is a win-win: a healthy environment, healthy pollinators, healthy and productive farms that save money in the process. And thank you for taking up this bill. I'm happy to take questions or talk further.
So, as you may have been following, there was a report brought to our committee regarding this very subject in terms of what the agency was put forward to come together with based on future practices with neonicotinoids. And I'm wondering if there was if this is just a coincidence that the timing of this is such, or was this put forward with the idea that that report may or may not be favorable to the interest of this bill?
It really is a coincidence.
Oh, fantastic.
This bill, my introduction of this bill was motivated by New York's action.
Mhm.
That said to me, here's a viable path forward.
Right.
And the fact that the Ag Innovation Board has done their research and done their work and issued their report now is really just kind of perfect timing in bringing the issue to the fore. And I would say the Agency of Ag's report on bees and the beekeepers' response to it has been another just timing that, again, elevates the issue.
Mhm.
Representative.
Robin, thank you. My request is that your prepared remarks, can you share that with
Absolutely.
the administrator, and so we would get copies of that
Yes. Happy to do that.
nice and informative.
Figure with all of the research that and testimony you've heard so far, I don't need to draw on it.
Oh, well, that's what I meant.
Representative O'Brien.
Ron, how does this bill work with, we've heard in the testimony that it's not just a, ban neonics, we're talking about treated seeds. So
Mhm.
we heard testimony about, fungicide only seeds without neonics, or diamides potentially replacing neonics. So how does it address those questions?
So the bill specifically only bans sale or use of neonicotinoid treated seed or direct application of neonicotinoids. So it doesn't address fungicides at all, or diamides. Leaves those as an open question.
We'll walk through the bill, as I said, in a few minutes, but can you talk a little bit more about, so you did mention that the secretaries of the two agencies could, in the event of an economic emergency or another situation, put some sort of a hold on things. Are there other exemptions that are in the bill? And I'm thinking specifically of, we have in our preliminary discussions talked a lot about seeds, but also there's been some conversation about spraying. And I think we've already heard from one request from someone to come in and who has an orchard would like to talk about that. So what's in the bill as far as spraying in an orchard?
So there are, in terms of spraying, there are restrictions, broad restrictions. No, you can't do it during bloom. Can't, not during tassel for corn. There are a number of thresholds that are laid out. But if it is an economic hardship, there can be a waiver granted. So in the case of this orchardist who does a very targeted application, and I'm assuming he's the one who was on Vermont Edition. If not, we can use him as an example. But there was an orchardist on Vermont Edition who talked about targeted applications, spraying at night when insect activity is low, never during bloom. Those would all be considerations. But he also claimed that there was no other tool that would achieve that goal. And that is something that the two agencies together would here make a determination on whether to allow that use or not.
So the language of the bill doesn't grant that exception. It would need to be, the language gives the authority to somebody else to grant the exception.
Correct.
Representative Templeman.
So there's a MOU for the two agencies to work together for this particular issue? Or?
As written in the bill,
Mhm.
the waiver is granted by the Agency of Natural Resources in consultation with Agency of Ag.
I see.
And I'll be right up front. In statute, traditionally, the Secretary of Ag has authority over pesticide use in the state of Vermont. This changes that for this application. And it does that primarily to set neonicotinoid use against a larger backdrop of environmental health, environmental emergency, let's say, for pollinator health, and take it out of the narrow wheelhouse of agriculture into the larger field of environmental health.
There are other other instances in which natural resources have similar authority to statute.
Not that I'm aware of. Yeah.
Other questions? We'll have plenty of opportunity to dig into many of these issues, including whatever we've heard about the New York State bill a couple of times now. We'll certainly learn more about that, what possible implications are for Vermont. And we'll actually, as soon as we're done interrogating Representative Justin Tegman, we'll hear from Mike O'Grady. Anything else?
I think, one of the perspectives of this is that use of widespread pesticide use, in a sense, is externalizing the costs, the downsides, in that the damage, the harm is to the public, the public good in terms of the environment. And this is seeking to protect that public good. And so it is, it's really that lens of protecting the public good, rather than trying to, certainly not trying to make life more difficult for anybody, but just recognizing that there is an externalization of harm, cost that exists in our standard farming practices, many of our practices, particularly in this case, farming. And that is part of the motivation behind this bill, or the perspective behind this bill.
Before you do, I want to flag, you made a comment, I think, about cost differential between treated seeds and seeds that aren't treated. And I'm not going to ask you to quantify that, but I think we've heard that, and it would make sense that
Mhm.
simply going through that process is going to add some cost to them. I'll be curious to know, just as we take testimony in this, how it's even possible to compare one to the other, given that one of them isn't on the market at all, and one of them is very much on the market.
So that's where the experience in Quebec comes into play.
Mhm.
The figure that I heard, and I have no firsthand knowledge of it, was that a bag of untreated corn seed is 20, possibly $30 cheaper than a bag of treated corn seed
In that,
in,
in
Quebec.
Representative Graham.
Well, that could be the variety of the corn.
There certainly could be
Yeah.
very numerous variables in there. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to talk over you.
I'll save it for later.
Representative Temple.
I was just wondering about that quote about the cost savings, although it is, you know, as you just established, relative to a few other concerns. It seems that coated seeds sometimes are quite a bit larger. So I'm wondering if the number of seeds is smaller in the same amount of weight, or is that
I can't speak to
okay?
that.
Fair enough.
Okay, thank you very much. We'll let you get back to your other.
Thank you. Actually, I think I'll stay and listen to as much
Okay, please.
through as I can.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Mike.
Want me to put the bill up on the screen or?
I think that's actually, I'm sort of coming around to that, yeah. And if anybody wants to also look at it on your devices, is on our page. Page 706.
Sonia, do I have the, Sonia here? Do I have the Zoom?
I sent it. Invite you. All of them.
Find it though. It's- Oh, six.
Page.
Okay. Okay, good. Better improve. The confidence.
Thanks for sharing, Joe. It's awesome. You should have shared it. Oh, no. It's good. Just. No. Sometimes I need. Because, right? Maybe. Yeah.
Should I begin?
Please.
This is Mike O'Grady with the Office of Legislative Counsel. I'm here to walk you through today an act relating to banning the use of neonicotinoid pesticides, H706. The bill does three major things. It bans the use of neonic treated seeds unless A&R issues an exemption. It bans other use of neonicotinoids unless A&R issues an exemption. And it makes conforming changes, including repealing the best managed practices rules that you required the AIB and the agency to issue regarding the use of neonicotinoid pesticides. So those are the three major things that it does. The bill begins with the findings section, page 2, line 8, recognizing the essential nature of wild and managed pollinators to Vermont's agricultural economy and environment. line 12, recognizing that Vermont is home to 300 native species and that many of those species have declined or disappeared. That 55% are in need of conservation. Next, page 2, line 18, that neonicotinoids are a class of neurotoxic systemic insecticides that are extremely toxic to bees and other pollinators. They're some of the most widely used insecticides in the world. On page 3, line 3, subdivision 4. Among other uses, neonicotinoids are commonly applied to crop seeds as prophylactic treatment. More than 90% of neonicotinoids applied to treated seeds move into soil and non-target plants. And according to the Agency of Agriculture, at least 1,197.66 tons of seeds sold in Vermont in 2022 were treated with neonicotinoids. Then page 3, line 8, integrated pest management is a technique that protects public health, the environment, and agricultural productivity. Under IPM, pesticides are a measure of last resort. And according to the European Academy Science Advisory Council, neonicotinoid seed treatments are incompatible with IPM. Page 3, line 14, a 2020 Cornell study analyzed more than 1,000 peer-reviewed studies found that neonicotinoid corn and soy pose substantial risk to bees. Pollinators provide no overall net income benefits. Department of Fish and Wildlife similarly recognizes that neonicotinoid use contributes to declining pollinator populations. Page 3, line 19, subdivision 7, a peer-reviewed study conducted by Harvard and published the journal Bulletin of Insectology concluded that sublethal exposures to neonics is likely the main culprit of colony collapse disorder. Page 4, line 3, a 2020 peer-reviewed study found that increased neonicotinoid use in the U.S. between 2008 and 2014 led to significant reduction in bird biodiversity. Then a 2022 peer-reviewed study in the journal Environment, Science, and Technology found neonicotinoids in 95% of the 171 pregnant women who participated in the study, and that there's another study that found that 49.1% of the U.S. general population has been exposed to neonicotinoids. The European Commission and the provinces of Quebec and Ontario have implemented significant prohibitions on the use of neonicotinoids. The New York General Assembly passed legislation that prohibits the sale or use of corn, soybean, and wheat seed treated with those 5 neonicotinoids. I do have to note that this finding is currently accurate, but when the governor of New York signed the bill, she wrote an approval memo that said that the bill needs to be amended. And the bill that's currently in the legislature in New York to do what the governor said needed to be done would still allow the use of neonicotinoid seeds according to basically a waiver issued by their Agency of Agriculture. So I can talk to you about that. I have that bill with me, but this is technically currently correct because New York hasn't passed that revision bill. But if they pass the revision bill, this finding won't technically be correct.
Let's pause before you go on to the next section, Representative Rice.
So if the revision bill requires a waiver for the use, wouldn't it still be correct to say that New York State prohibits?
Yeah, so it does say beginning 2027, it shall be prohibited to use these. However, that the commissioner may by written order temporarily suspend that prohibition at any time based on the commissioner's determination after consulting with the Commissioner of Agricultural Markets, that there's an insufficient amount of commercially available seed to adequately supply the agricultural market that has not been treated with a neonicotinoid. So it's a prohibition, but with the potential for that prohibition to be suspended.
And sorry, you said in consultation with the Commissioner of Agriculture. So who is the commissioner who's making the?
So this is the Commissioner of Environmental Conservation.
This?
I had a question of going back to the page 3 and finding number 4, the second sentence, or the third sentence, I guess. The amount, the tonnage of seeds that were sold in Vermont in 2022. Do we have data, that same metric looking back into the past?
That's a good question. I don't know how far it goes back into the past. The agency does have a pesticide tracking report, pesticide use report. I know some of the reports include the use of treated seeds. I don't know how far back it goes.
This wasn't something that was put in place in 2022 or 2020 in the legislation.
The need to track.
Yeah,
Well, they're supposed to report on the need to treated article seeds. But before that, even they had a pesticide use report. And so I don't know how far back that goes. Yeah.
Any other questions about any of these findings? Okay.
So the second section is a definition section. It is basically adding definitions at the end of the section related to what is an agricultural commodity, what is an agricultural emergency, what is bloom, what's a crop group, what is an environmental emergency, an ornamental plant, and turf. So the definition of agricultural commodity, that is basically the same definition that's used elsewhere in agricultural statute, specifically 6 VSA section 21. An agricultural emergency is when the neonicotinoid treated seed could be used, when we'll look at that in a minute. So as with an environmental emergency, these are new definitions. They're not elsewhere in statute. So an ag emergency is an occurrence of any pest that presents an imminent risk of significant harm, injury, or loss to agricultural crops. And then an environmental emergency is an occurrence of any pest that presents a significant risk of harm or injury to the environment, or significant harm, injury, or loss to ag crops, including any exotic or foreign pest that may need quarantine. Bloom is a new definition as well, not elsewhere in statute. The period from the onset of flowering or inflorescence until petal fall is complete. Crop group relates to, it's a USDA definition of the different types of agricultural commodities. I can provide you with that section if you would like. It's largely raw agricultural commodities in the citate in that subsection C that is cited. And then ornamental plants, perennials, annuals, and ground cover, purposely planted for aesthetic reasons. And then turf. This is an existing definition of turf in statute. I believe this definition is from Title 10, not Title 6. But it's land planted in closely mowed, managed grasses, including residential and commercial property and publicly owned land, parks, and recreation. It's not pasture. It's not cropland. It's not land used to grow sod or land for other ag production. So they all play into how the prohibition works. Prohibitions.
So turf, the last sentence, turf does not include land used to grow sod. I was thinking basically in everyday parlance, we could think of it as lawn, grass you would grow for your farm.
I think that's a good way to look at it. Yes. Yes.
But not land used to grow sod. So that, and I'm a little just confused about that.
So a sod farm is an agricultural production facility. And they are pretty, they have to be set up in a certain way to allow for the proper harvesting of the sod. So it's a little different from just lawn because the roots aren't allowed to set to the extent where they can't be harvested. So that's why it's there.
Okay.
And this definition is from the prohibition on basically commercial residential application of phosphorus and nitrogen fertilizer.
So that definition exists in chapter or title 10.
Title 10.
Okay, well, if we need to, we can come back to that as we move to the actual, text. Representative O'Brien.
Mike, you had a question?
No, I'm good. Thank you.
Okay. Grady, are invasives, could they be considered ornamental plants? Because most of them began their life as ornamental plants in nurseries and then escaped.
We don't make that distinction here. So the Norway maple, well, that's a tree. It's not a perennial or annual or ground cover.
Japanese knotweed, right?
Japanese knotweed.
Bush, all
Right. That doesn't make that distinction here. So moving on to section 3, this is the section that bans the use and sale of neonicotinoid treated seed. No persons shall sell, offer for sale, distribute, or use any neonicotinoid treated article seed for soybeans or for any crop in the cereal grains crop group, which does include corn. And then the Secretary of Natural Resources, in consultation with the Secretary of Ag, may issue a written exemption order to suspend the provisions of that prohibition. I want to stop there. Generally, not generally, in statute, there are 2 provisions that says the Secretary of Agriculture has the exclusive or sole authority to regulate pesticides within the state. So this is giving the Secretary of Natural Resources some authority over the use of certain pesticides or pesticide products. There's going to be 2 subsequent conforming changes later in the bill to change that Secretary of Agriculture exclusive authority.
Supernet.
Who in this circumstance would have ultimate authority if the consultation described wasn't coming to an agreement?
Well, the Secretary of Natural Resources is the one that has to issue the order. So if they can't agree, then the A&R has the ultimate authority on whether or not to issue the order. So the order has to include certain information. It needs to specify the types of treated article seeds to which the exemption order applies, the date on which the exemption order takes effect, its duration, and its geographic scope. It has to provide a detailed evaluation of the ag seed market, including a determination either that the purchase of seeds that comply with the prohibition would cause agricultural producers undue financial hardship, or that there is an insufficient amount of commercially available seed not treated with neonicots to supply agricultural producers. And then last, the order needs to provide a detailed evaluation of the exemption order's anticipated effect on pollinator populations, bird populations, ecosystem health, and public health. Then it may also establish restrictions related to the use of the neonicotinoid treated article seeds to which the exemption applies in order to minimize harm to pollinators, bird populations, ecosystem health, and public health. And it may establish other restrictions related to the use of the seeds to which the exemption applies if the Secretary of Natural Resources considers that necessary. And upon issuing a written exemption, the Secretary of Natural Resources sends a copy to you, the General Assembly. And then the Secretary of Natural Resources, in consultation with the Secretary of Ag, may rescind an exemption order. The such rescission comes into effect no sooner than 30 days after the issuance and shall not apply to neonicotinoid treated article seeds planted or sown before such precision. So you don't have to take the seed out of the ground once you planted it under the waiver. Section 4 is a very similar section, but it relates to general use of neonicotinoid pesticides, not just those that are treated articles. So the following uses of neonicotinoid pesticides are prohibited: the outdoor application to any crop during bloom, the outdoor application to any crop between heading or tassel, and the outdoor application to crops in the leafy vegetable, basically brassica, bulb vegetables, herbs and spices, and stalk, stem, and leaf with those crop numbers, the application to ornamental plants, and the application to turf grass. So that those are all prohibited. The Secretary of Natural Resources, in consultation with the Secretary of Ag, issues that written exemption order to that prohibition. Again, very similar to the exemption order content for neonicotinoid treated article seeds. It specifies what pesticide can be used, duration, date, scope, provides a detailed evaluation determining the ag emergency or an environmental, or if an environmental emergency exists, provides, addresses how the pesticide is going to address that emergency in an effective way, provides a detailed evaluation of the order's anticipated effects on pollinators, bird populations, etc. And then it may include restrictions related to the use, which the exemption applies, or establish other restrictions related to its use. So upon issuing that order, allowing the neonicotinoid use, the Secretary of Natural Resources sends you notice. And then the Secretary of Natural Resources and the Secretary of Ag may rescind that exemption order.
Pause there and see if anybody has questions. The, are there other instances, existing instances of the, of a secretary, an agency secretary, having this authority and having to alert the legislature each time they issue an exemption?
I think the only one I can think of is when when there's a forest fire and certain laws are suspended to respond to the forest fire, there has to be notice to the General Assembly of that. That's the only one I can think of.
Questions? I'm just going to go back to this section, and we had a conversation earlier with the bill presenter on the foliar application, I guess, in orchards. So the definition of bloom that we talked about earlier was specific, and it reads to me as though there wouldn't be any prohibition then, like before or after the last petal falls, then.
Yes, and I
crop.
I think that that's a good point, that general application, unless it's otherwise specifically prohibited, is only prohibited during the bloom of the crop. Because the concern is that the pollinators are being affected because they're coming to the crop while it's in bloom. There's pesticide on the blooms.
Okay. Representative Graham.
In that case, I mean, if you use it prior to blooming, plant might bring it in the bloom. Still might have the same effect. The other thing is, question I have is, the way this is written, if a farmer or farmers or industry, whatever you want to call it, put an attachment on their planter, drop this pesticide in the row in front of the seed. Is that would that be prohibited in this law?
So it wouldn't, you're not using a treated article seed. You're just applying the pesticide in the same row as an untreated seed.
Yeah.
So it could not be applied to crops that are on page 10, line 3 through 6. So anything with stalk, stem, and leaf, vegetable crop groups that are listed in the crop groups in the USDA crop grouping. And it couldn't be applied, well, that's probably your biggest, the biggest prohibition. It might not apply to all crops, but it's going to apply to a substantial amount of crops.
You thinking cereal and you thinking corn?
Well, farmers are pretty adapted to
Hmm.
doing things. Yeah, for the past. What line are you reading from my section, number 3?
So crop groups 3. Second.
Page 10, line 3.
Crop. So crop group 3 is garlic, leeks, onions, shallots. Crop group 3.07 is chives, garlic, leek, lilies, onions. 4 is celery, herbal, corn salad. I don't know what that is, corn salad. Endive, bell,
Sounds like a recipe.
lettuce,
Yeah, no, I'm writing this down.
rhubarb, spinach. 416 is not specifically listed here. 5 was broccoli, cabbage, collards, kale, greens. 19 further in. 19 is basically all the spices that you can think of, from allspice to wormwood.
So it's just restating that thing that already.
Yeah.
It seems to be, yeah.
And so should I move on?
I think, well, yeah, I think we ought to flag that, but,
So just,
Representative Rice, yeah.
just to clarify that not included there are cereals, corns.
Not in this.
Yeah.
Cereals and soy would not be included in those lists. So if Representative Graham went out there and then planted untreated corn and soy and then applied neonicotinoids over the top, I don't think that would prohibit.
That's not really what I was saying. Usually a planter makes an opening. Seed drops in, and then that closes that. But you could put an attachment so that you could drop that chemical in that opening where you drop the seed, close it back up.
Right, so I had it reversed, right? You're applying the pesticide first and then applying the seed.
It's on the same trip.
Right. I don't see how that's prohibited in our lives.
Okay, so we were at section 4?
Yeah, so a couple of years ago, you made neonicotinoid pesticides as a restricted use pesticide. Except unrestricted use pesticide means that the person who sells it has to be certified. And the person who uses it as an applicator needs to be certified. They're also called Class A pesticides in the terminology used by the Agency of Agriculture's pesticide rule. But you provided certain exemptions from the requirement that neonics be restricted use. And those exemptions are on page 13, line 12 through 18, one of which was treated article seed. Treated article seed was exempt from registration as a Class A/restricted use pesticide. But now you've prohibited it unless there's that exemption order. So what then happens is effectively by striking this exemption, you've made it a restricted use pesticide. So when it is used underneath that exemption order, it has to be sold by a certified retailer seller, and it has to be used by a certified applicator. Now, most farmers get a certification for application, so it really won't affect them that it's a restricted use pesticide. It will affect where they are sold. Because most seeds are already treated in some way, whether or not with neonicotinoids or not. So those that are treated with neonicotinoids, say at a hardware store, will no longer be sold at the hardware store.
For commercial purposes or for
Or
homeowners?
just like homeowner use.
Gardens?
Yeah.
Okay.
So that's that section. Section 6 and 7 relate to what I referred to earlier as that the currently in statute, the jurisdiction in all matters pertaining to the distribution, sale, and transportation of economic poisons is by this chapter vested exclusively in the Secretary of Agriculture. And then in the other chapter in Title VI related to the use of pesticides, unless otherwise provided in statute, the Secretary has responsibility for regulating and controlling the sale, use, storage, treatment, and disposal of pesticides. So just a little aside here, most state agencies of agriculture have sole authority to regulate pesticides, and most have preemption authority that they preempt like local control or regulation of pesticides unless that is somehow otherwise authorized in that state statute. There's only around 8 states that don't have explicit preemption. Vermont doesn't have explicit preemption, but it has implied preemption because it says it's the exclusive authority, or they are the ones that has responsibility for regulating. So the agency has always interpreted this language as meaning they have the sole authority to regulate pesticides in the state.
So two things there. It's this agency as opposed to some other agency that has the authority, and local municipalities can't.
So local municipalities control where pesticides are used on property that they own because they're just a property owner and they control, we're not going to apply pesticides on this property, on school property, in proximity, in parks, in proximity to waters, et cetera. That's their ownership right. But they can't prohibit neonicotinoid pesticides in their municipalities on their own.
Okay. Representative Rice?
How does Vermont between explicit and implied compare to New York?
I don't know. No, I don't think I have. There's a good report from the Sea Grant College about preemption at the local level. I can get that to you. And then section 8 repeals that requirement that you put in law that the agency and the AIB proposed to you rules establishing best management practices for the use of neonicotinoid treated article seeds. If this is kind of a, maybe you still want them because maybe they'll still be used, but they are theoretically prohibited unless the exemption order is issued. So you could either repeal the BMPs or amend the BMPs so the BMPs are only when authorized for use under an exemption order. It could go either way here. And then the effective dates, the findings, the definition, the registration, and the prospective repeal of the BMP rules take effect on passage. The prohibited use of neonicotinoid pesticides and the sole amending the sole authority of the secretary takes effect on July 1, 2025. And then for treated article seed, that will take effect on January 1, 2027. And let me just see. In the proposed revision in New York, it would be 2027 as well. So that would be consistent with what is being contemplated in New York.
Representative Rice?
Do you not feel like the written exemptions required section 3 and 4 do the work of the BMPs in the case of?
They could. I mean, it's a good point because the exemption has enough authority to set restrictions, et cetera, et cetera. My one consideration in response is that's going to be issued by the Secretary of Natural Resources after consultation with the Secretary of Ag. Maybe you want the Secretary of Ag and the AIB to just set standards that the Secretary of Natural Resources just requires as part of those exemption orders. You know, but it really, you could go either way with that. You could just repeal the BMPs, or you could keep the BMPs for purposes of use under an exemption. I don't really have a recommendation on that. I think it works either way.
Any other questions? Okay. Thank you, Mike. I think we've got a pretty good understanding of what's in the bill now. And we've got some other witness testimony lined up, and there'll be more coming, I think, next week. Let's